welcome everyone to this Pint of Science panel, which is all about ethical considerations in the digital era. Thank you so much for joining us online. I know this is the new normal for everyone, but it's still really exciting to have you here with us. Before I go any further, I really want to recognise that we're holding these events essentially in Australia, and usually when we hold Pint of Science across Australia, we recognise the local Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nations, of which we have a huge range across Australia that represent incredible diversity in language, culture, and history that exists, the longest living history on the planet. Now that we're online, and our speakers and a lot of our audience are living and are from like really different parts of Australia, we want to recognise and acknowledge everyone, all traditional custodians of country, the first innovators and the first scientists of the land. We want to pay our respects to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elders, past, present, and future, and recognise their continuing relationship with the land, waters, and culture. And more than that, we want to recognise that sovereignty was never ceded. And on the back of many, I would say, fairly empty words, as someone who is not officially a representative of any organisation right now, that there was a lot of bloodshed that resulted in modern Australia, and a lot of unnecessary bloodshed in that process. So the land was stolen, and I invite everyone to just take a moment and sit with that knowledge, particularly given that we're going to be speaking about Indigenous data sovereignty tonight. My name is Sophia Frentz. I've got a very hodgepodge background that runs across data science and data science. Currently, I work as a consultant at ELIZA, which is a consultancy for AI, data science, and machine learning. And just generally, I'm a bit of a troublemaker. So that's why I'm an MC tonight. I'm also currently on the land of the Cubby Cubby people up in Noosa. But I typically reside in Melbourne, in the lands of the Kulin Nation. And something that's really important to just kind of like pay, credence to tonight is the fact that tonight Melbourne's going into their 4th lockdown. I will be joining you in that tomorrow, but we know how hard it is. And if anyone's joined us here from Melbourne, we're sorry, and you're going to get through this. We believe in you, which sounds like so empty when I say it, but I was in all the other lockdowns, so like it does mean something. Tonight is all about ethics and data in the digital era. Like, over the last probably 18 months now, you've spent a lot of time online. You've streamed a lot of content online. You've engaged with social media because that is the only way we can talk to our family and friends during like a 6+ month lockdown. Behind all of this convenience and content and access sits just a huge web of algorithms, which is working to personalize your online experience. And our digital footprint makes targeted advertising so easy. It's embarrassing how good Facebook is at targeting various types of glitter to me. Over 70% of us are now active on social media and spending over an hour and a half consuming content across all of the different platforms we can use. And many of these platforms owned by the same media conglomerates, and that's just a hoover of data sucking up heaps of information about us. As big data gets bigger and AI gets smarter, this presents both challenges and opportunities. This evening, we're going to be talking about both sides of that with the help of 4 brilliant panelists who I'm so excited to introduce to you all. We'll be exploring questions like, how are the implications of our digital footprint being used to shape the world we live in? And what kind of say do we have in it? And how can we develop AI in an ethical way, a way that benefits our entire society and includes perspectives from across our community and not just those of a privileged few? Tonight, we'll delve into these questions, but you can ask yours as well through our live stream and on Twitter. You can leave a comment on our YouTube, or you can tweet us using the hashtag PintAU21. So that's PINT AU21 with a hashtag in front of it. So I'm going to be working through the panelists shortly, but very briefly, we've got Dr. Mark Cheong, a Senior Fellow and Research Fellow in Digital Ethics at the Melbourne University Centre for AI and Digital Ethics. We've got Dr. Paula Oliva Altamirano, a Principal Data Scientist at our community. We've got Mr. Darren Clinch, the Data Analytics Coordinator at the Indigenous Data Network. And we've had a last-minute change of speaker, so if you saw Ellen Broad on our list, unfortunately she couldn't join us tonight. Instead, we're thrilled to welcome Ms. Lorraine Ruster, Responsible Technology Consultant and recent graduate of the ANU School of Cybernetics Masters of Applied Cybernetics. There we go. So I'm just going to invite everyone to give us a really quick overview of their work, and let's start with Mark.
Thanks, Sophia. So my name's Mark. As Sophia introduced me, I'm a senior fellow at the Melbourne Law School and also a research fellow at the Centre for AI Digital Ethics, Faculty of Engineering and IT. So I deal with digital ethics, so that it ranges from things like analyzing social media for public health response during the COVID outbreak. This is a partnership I'm doing with the Burnett Institute. And my team is working on the ethics of chatbots, for example. And that also ranges from two different disciplines, ranging from philosophy, which myself and my colleague Simon delve into, and into law as well, my colleague Kobe Lyons, as well as technology, because without technology, there won't be digital ethics. I guess today I'm just happy to share insights from the world of digital ethics, especially philosophy, because in terms of background, I was trained as a data scientist. Back then, there were no data scientists, only computer scientists. So I actually studied Twitter and the metadata behind Twitter. And ironically, now my Twitter feed is only on cryptic crossword puzzles and chatting with the people who set cryptic crossword puzzles. I don't use it for anything else. So that's the irony. And yep, looking forward to chatting with everyone. Yep. Thanks, Sophia. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Mark. I don't think we can talk at all about digital ethics without talking about the Indigenous perspective and Indigenous data sovereignty and how we use data there. So Darren, would you like to just give us a quick overview of what you're about? You're on mute, Darren.
Oh my goodness, I didn't think I'd hear that again tonight. My apologies. So, hi everyone, my name's Darren Clinch. I'm the Indigenous Data Analytics Coordinator for the Indigenous Data Network, which is an initiative of the Indigenous Studies Unit within the Melbourne School of Population Global Health at University of Melbourne. So really our aim is to look at how can we better describe the health and wellbeing of Aboriginal people, not just from a deficit perspective, which is what we've ended up with administrative data, but then to also look at the data that Aboriginal people not only capture, modify, transform, and then report on. So we're looking at the whole gamut of data that's available for Aboriginal people. So, and my background is in all sorts of things. So I've done all sorts of jobs, worked in Aboriginal community organisations, worked in Aboriginal health for a long time. So, and I'll talk a little bit further about that as we go along. So back to you, Sophia.
I'm honestly so excited to hear more from Darren. I know I shouldn't play favourites as the MC, but like it's a little bit my favourite. Paola, I know that our community does a lot of sort of for good work in the data science space. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what you've been doing lately and sort of your background?
Thank you. So my background is I'm Honduras, moved into Australia like 9 years ago. And I'm an astrophysics, so my PhD and postdoc and a few experience in astrophysics from Swinburne University. And then I decided to transition in data science, and I was lucky enough to find a very nice position in the social sector. So I work for this company called Our Community, and we do a lot of different technology for the social sector. That includes grants. So we administrate Smarty Grants, which is a grants platform. And we have a lot of data coming through that. And then we also have other sort of platforms like Give Now, which is a donation platform, Good Jobs, which is a jobs platform. And we also have a lot of training and information. So I had a lot of experience with ethical problems when you're doing data science, not because I want to, but because they're all over the place. Every time I try to build any sort of solution, digital solution, then we have to answer all the hard questions, and how are we going to use this data, and what kind of decision making are we driving. So at the beginning, for me, it was just facing them face to face. Now I'm trying to understand them better, and so I've joined a couple of committees around ethical considerations. So I joined the Standard Australians Committee, which are a lot of volunteers working to build the standards in the AI solutions. And now I'm partnering with Lorraine. We're actually trying to test her framework. So I will probably let her introduce that part.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And Paola's made the segue for me. So Lorraine, tell us about your stuff.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm calling in from Bidjigalland near Sydney Airport, actually. And I suppose there's a few different threads that could describe how I ended up here. So I've studied across a lot of different fields, so in science and engineering, but also in humanities and business. And I think there's probably maybe 4 threads that connect to today, and one of those is my background in the corporate sector, in consulting, mainly in strategy consulting, but also focused for the last, say, 7 years on being part of a team that was building an Indigenous consulting business within the PricewaterhouseCoopers network of firms. And so from that, learned a lot about looking at data from lots of different ways and dealing with complex stakeholders in interesting and novel ways, and harnessing that Indigenous wisdom by working in an Indigenous run and Indigenous owned business. And then the second thing I think would be, a few years ago, I was a fellow with an impact investor called Acumen. And as part of that, we were looking at social impact measurement. And that took me to Uganda for a little while, working in a solar energy social enterprise and using data in new ways on the ground there. And most recently, I think, and this is where Paola and I have met each other, has been through doing a master's program at the Australian National University School of Cybernetics in applied cybernetics. And that's really been focused around like the future of AI related systems and how they can scale in ways that are safe, sustainable and responsible. And as part of that, I was part of a research project with Thea Snow from the Centre for Public Impact. And we have been looking at the role of dignity when looking at AI ethics instruments. And we've sort of come up with a model to sort of test with different stakeholders around what dignity could bring when you're talking about ethics. And that's how we've met Paola and have done some initial work to try and test our framework with her, which has been really exciting. So it's great to be here.
That's so good.
Thanks, Sophia.
So I'm going to kick you all off with a really just like easy lowball question. Obviously, data science, AI, like it's given us so much and has so much potential. What do you think is the biggest issue facing society when it comes to data science and AI and big data? Whoever has an answer first can start. I know it's a big question.
Well, I'm going to just jump in here and use my elder status just to kind of point out that I've been using computer technology for 37 years, actually. The first time I used a computer was one that my brother hired from radio rentals. It was an Amstrad 720K PC, didn't have a hard drive. But it kind of taught me to start thinking about what's possible in 5 years' time, what's possible in 10 years' time, and starting to position myself in a way that I can kind of keep up with that. So, and I know that particularly from an Aboriginal perspective, a lot of Aboriginal people are kind of caught behind the 8 ball a little bit to keep up with, the developments like AI and like machine learning and augmented reality. And yet I can see how much that could, coupled with Indigenous culture, song, storytelling, and combining that with technology is just the vision I can see is unbelievable. I was almost going to swear, then I won't, because I know we're live. But just making sure that we're people that really benefit from this aren't left behind.
That's amazing. Lorraine, do you want to weigh in on that? Either that or my question.
I think one of the biggest issues, which is sort of a bit of what Darren was touching on there, is how do we bring people into the conversation where these technologies are most impacting? And I think part of the challenge is that there seems to be like this big divide between the people that are designing and implementing the technologies and then the people who may be most impacted by them. And so I think one of the big challenges is how do we start to bridge that divide? How do we have more people, different types of people in the conversations, so that we can see the impacts of these technologies or foresee the impacts of these technologies from different perspectives. And so one of the things that I'm really interested in is how do we start to open these conversations and bring it into the language of people where they're at, and not discount the fact that they would have something to add because they're not a computer science graduate or something. These are ubiquitous systems that are going to be impacting our lives even more than they are today, and so it's relevant to everyone. And so I think there's a big communication piece as well as who can be part of that design, and obviously preferencing voices that are traditionally not in the conversation, and Indigenous people's voices would be one of those groups, is really paramount to the future potential of what this technology could do if we had different representation in the room.
Yeah. Mark, with your work on ethics, would you see that lack of inclusion as being where our biggest barrier is?
Yep, definitely. That's a very good point as well. So with recent work with colleagues, we basically went through, for example, computer science publishing records. So, for example, who has published in computer science in the past, let's say, a couple of decades. And the sad thing is, diversity is an issue because all we find are male computer scientists who are writing all the research papers. So the thing is, in order to start making computer science a more diverse field, we need to welcome and make sure everyone feels welcome in taking part in computer science research. Not just computer science, but also related subfields, subdisciplines, for example, human-computer interaction and information systems. It should not just be, for example, a boys' club. That's wrong. So, yep, hopefully in the future, computer science also needs to engage with other disciplines as well. It's not just the tech, because computing affects everyone. Computing affects the social media sites we use. It affects, for example, our job applications, because chances are it's probably being screened by an ML-based program before it even reaches a human. So, yep, that's my take on it. And, yep, looking forward to hearing what Paola has to say as well.
Yeah, I must firstly break the unfortunate news that partnering with other disciplines won't necessarily help because of someone with a biology background. We've also got that really big problem where men partner with other powerful men and then self-cite until the end of time. But yeah, Paola, the biggest issues facing using big data and AI appropriately.
Oh, there are so many. I will say in my experience is understanding that whatever you're building, it has really big repercussions. And probably in my field is very obvious because I work for the social sector. So everything we build, we know is going to drive some sort of decision. We know it has to be inclusive. We know that we could amplify the biases that are already there rather than mitigate them. But I also think this applies to everything. So when I talk to people who does the science in industry, sometimes you tend to forget that you are also building something that is going to be used by humans regardless. So even if you're just selling books in Amazon and you say, well, this is just a sell company, you are deciding who's going to buy this type of books and who's going to buy these other types of books. And so you are practically driving that division and that lack of diversity when we are talking about subjects and other things. So in my job, obviously we have that problem. So every time we have to do different steps in the building, we need to keep in mind the global picture. We need to keep in mind who's the user, how the user is gonna see it. We need to keep in mind that every user is different. So even if we are putting something out, the user will have a different perspective. And so I think the big challenge is that training, that middle step between the person who's actually building the solution and the person who's using the solution. How do you communicate? How did you build this? And what's the best way of using it to try to reduce the biases? But there are many other challenges.
Yeah, that consideration of who you're building for is huge. Like, I've definitely bumped up against that quite a few times. In my previous job, there were a number of surveys that were compulsory that I could not fill out as a non-binary person because you had to provide your gender and there were only 2 options. Yeah. So that's a really obvious example of that, but I'm sure everyone can think of a huge range. I can see we're getting a lot of really great questions coming through on our YouTube. Don't stop. But I do really want to touch on the idea of Indigenous data sovereignty before we get into your amazing questions. So I'm firstly going to invite Darren to talk initially around the idea of Indigenous data sovereignty in Australia, how it's seen and applied here, because I had sort of established this with the panelists beforehand. As a New Zealander, I have context for that. I don't necessarily have the context for Australia really at all. And I'd love to hear from Darren where we're at and where we could be going. You're on mute again, Darren. You're 2 for 2. I love it.
Sorry, I've got a dog walking around the house and I thought you didn't want to hear the clip-clop going on. So, yeah, thank you for the opportunity to talk about it. And look, there's been a big movement, I think, that's been driven by the fact that historically, capture systems haven't been designed by Aboriginal people. And a classic example would be, and I always try and give practical examples when I explain this, is that if you go into a hospital, and I'll take the Victorian context because I'm very familiar with the Victorian hospital data, they don't ask, who's your mob? And that's a really, really important thing because as Aboriginal people, we usually identify who our mob is. So I'm Buddy Meyer from Yamiji country, currently here on Ghana country, or Adelaide if you like. And so there's all those other contextual bits of information that would give you a more complete story about Aboriginal people. But if you've got a system that's not designed by someone who doesn't identify those 2 gender boxes that you can tick, like you said, Sophia, then they're missing out on all that extra information. So it kind of leads you to this thing called pseudo-objectivity, where people don't realise their implicit bias is driven what they capture about people. So if I draw that and then link it to Indigenous data sovereignty, really what we're saying is we're helping to use data to rebuild the sovereign identity of all those different groups. Because the ABS will not tell you how many Buddy Mai people there are. They won't tell you how many Wiradjuri people there are. And that's really, really important, and particularly when you relate to things like birthing on country. Hospitals don't collect that information, so you can't tell how many Aboriginal people have had to travel extra distances because they want to birth their children on country, so when their child is older, they give them that that kind of cultural strengthening that's been damaged by colonisation, particularly across the eastern seaboard of this country. And what you see, and I've seen this with a lot of younger Aboriginal people, they'll say their mental health is related to their identity or lack of, because the culture is not there to pass on. And regardless of whether anybody else sees Aboriginal culture as important or not, it's important to those individuals. So that data can actually strengthen it, because if we use something like, let's say, for instance, iBlade, which is the Indigenous Business Longitudinal Analysis data environment, it can tell us how many Aboriginal businesses are operating on Wiradjuri country. So there's business opportunities for young people to look at that and go, I can be what I can see. So Indigenous data sovereignty has to have a lot of things, more than just ownership, control, access, possession. And they're the principles that came from OCAP, or the First Nations people of Canada. Then you've got Tahu Kukatai, who wrote a very large volume in conjunction with John Taylor, I think it was, a very large volume, and that was very typically from a New Zealand perspective. And Sophia, you might be familiar with Kahu's work. Yep. And so that has come to Australia. Now, if we look at UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples around the world, it kind of touches on it, but it doesn't say, let's go and do what they do with Aboriginal artefacts. We have this whole thing about repatriating Aboriginal artefacts from, German museums or UK museums, bring them back to here to Australia and give them back to the people where they was taken from in the first place. We can think, we're not really talking about repatriation of data that was collected by white anthropologists over a long period of time, which has really coloured the fabric of Australian society and has really denied the Australian population of understanding the complexity of Aboriginal people. So we can talk about this from a philosophical perspective, or we can go to the government and say, under your 5 safes, which is the National Data Commission's approach to data security, we want to make sure that Indigenous data sovereignty is built into it. So we stop having data held in the hands of non-Aboriginal people, dictating and being the power, because we know data is power, and that has been the picture that most people think of Aboriginal people. And there's many examples that I could give you related to, alcohol consumption, family violence, the whole lot. I've spent lots and lots of time looking at this data, consulting with organisations like ABS, Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, all of those organisations about how do we get more data in the hands of Aboriginal people so they can then take ownership of their story, but not Aboriginal people. That's a coverall homogenising word. So data can be a way we can de-homogenise that and say what is health and wellbeing for Budimai people compared to what is data sovereignty to Anangu people or the Yolngu people, because they're very, very different, very, very different. So it's a really complex thing, and I'm glad you pointed that out at the start there. Thank you.
Something that was really surprising to me moving to Australia, my background being in genetics, was in New Zealand you have to talk to, the iwi, the kaumātua, the elders, if you want to do genetic studies with a particular iwi, and nothing like that existed here, really. Like, if people did it, it was because they wanted to and thought it was a good thing, rather than something that was like ingrained in how we did research. And in all honesty, it was a bit horrifying. And I can't speak to the 200 plus years of terrible treatment that Indigenous people have had, but this is a way to start making the world better, tiny steps at a time.
Well, and I saw on the news today this around the blood of thousands of Indigenous peoples that's been held in an ANU lab, and the sort of the process of repatriation of the blood that's been, I think has been there like 50 years or something in this lab at ANU. And the thing that really struck me about hearing that story today was this very complex kind of trade-off that the people whose ancestors' blood it was making between, do we bring that blood back to country and undertake the cultural practices associated with that, and then balancing that with potentially this blood could be really helpful for scientific purposes and for the future of our people as well. So I thought it was really fascinating that, some of those people, at least in the article I was reading, had decided that they would agree to the genomic material being extracted from the blood, but then the rest of the blood actually being taken back to the land that it came from for their cultural practices. And I think that this is an interesting example of the innovative ways that that we can think about data. Obviously, this is a scenario where data sovereignty did not happen for the people whose blood was taken probably without their consent and used for purposes that it wasn't originally intended for. But there's also a part of me that just thinks that there's so many ways that we can think about how to use data in new and novel ways. And obviously this is a really unfortunate example of that. But when I think of Indigenous data sovereignty, as Darren was saying, I think the whole data ecosystem. So not just the collection part of that story, but also the application and the story and the ownership of the people whose data it is to tell the story that they want to tell with that data. And I think that sometimes that can be lost in the process when we talk about data. We're focused on collection, but it's also like the analysis that gets put on that, the narrative that then gets told with that data, and people having control over what that narrative is with the data that's being collected, I think is an interesting and important part of the Indigenous data
Absolutely.
I think that's important, not just for Indigenous data sovereignty, but any individual's data. I find, like, my team has found out the wrong way, I guess, that it's a crucial step when you're doing data cleaning to actually go on site and try to see whose data are you collecting. If you're working with children in foster care, then go and spend a day with the children. If you're working in selling books, then go and spend a day and try to buy the books. So then when you're looking at the data, when you're cleaning that data, then you understand what is it that you're cleaning and, like, what does it mean. What my friends and coworkers in the innovation lab, Nathan Mitsfus and Sarah Barker, have done a fantastic job engaging with non-for-profits and trying to make this as human as possible. And we do realize that many times when we look at the data, it's like, oh, this is super interesting. And when you talk to the non-for-profits and the users of the data, they're like, oh yeah, we didn't the data, it was there. Or like someone put it, or so. If you don't have that immediate connection to what the data means, then the models obviously are going to be wrong. So definitely applies for Indigenous sovereignty, but like applies for everyone's data in general.
Yeah, absolutely. I've got a question from Amy on YouTube, specifically asking Mark, although I think everyone will have opinions on this, to expand on the ideas, firstly, of how philosophy intersects with technology, but then really drilling down into what are some ethical dangers of technology usage.
Thanks, Sophia. So, from my own research, I'll probably use two quick examples of how philosophy intersects with technology. First of all, there's a subfield of philosophy called epistemology, the study of knowledge. And without, for example, studies in social epistemology, we're not able to interrogate our relationship with technology, not just the technology itself, but through, for example, other people we communicate using a technology facilitated medium. Case in point, Facebook cat videos. It's not just all about the cat videos, but it's about connecting with other people through a shared medium. For example, if I add someone on Facebook or if I message someone on Twitter, for instance. And the interesting part about epistemology is it lets us investigate how knowledge is spread between person to person on such medium, on such a medium. And I think it's important because if you have, for example, to counter, let's say, vaccine misinformation, we need to know how people grasp knowledge, how people change their beliefs. And that's just one example. And the other example that I'm passionate about, because that's a pet project of mine for the past few years, is existentialist philosophy, basically how we connect with other people, how we, for example, relate to the world. Is the world looking at us? And what's called the phenomenological gaze. And I find that you can actually tie that again with social media because you have your own portrayal of authenticity online. Is it really authentic? Is it really not? How do we avoid accidentally, for example, making use of or exploiting other people through, for example, ads, or if we endorse a given product online, it turns out it's fake news, it's not really a cure for a given disease, for example. That affects our relationship with the rest of the world. So I hope that answers the first part of the question, Sophia.
Yeah, that's really good. And then generally, I think everyone can probably comment on what the ethical dangers of technology use really are in sort of very broad strokes.
Well, I'll jump in here and just add a comment. I think social media has been an absolute boon for Aboriginal people too, because prior to that, the only outlets you had for information about Aboriginal people from a media perspective was a very narrow selection of TV channels, which I won't criticise too much, but they haven't been overly friendly to us blackfellas. But social media has been an absolute boon because we're able to find those little pockets of social media and technology where we're able to tell our own story. So we've seen a very high uptake of Aboriginal people in the use of this technology. So while it does have its negative sides, and I've learnt not to read the comments whenever there's a story about Aboriginal people. So, but it also gives us the chance to challenge some of the myths where the vacuum of knowledge exists, so people still perpetuate myths about Aboriginal people. And social media has gone a long way to helping us address that and be able to be part of telling the story where previously it was left to non-Aboriginal academics and universities. So.
I think a lot of the challenges when it comes to dangers of technologies come back to like the values that are underpinning those technologies that are designed in. I think sometimes we think about technologies as being this sort of thing that's out there in the world that is sort of doing things to us, but there's people behind those technologies that are making decisions about what they should do, when they should be used, what data sets they're being built on. And so really who's making the decision is still a human that designs and decides to implement that technology. But there's obviously lots of challenges with the implementation of technologies and it turning into things that perhaps the designer could not have envisioned. And I think a lot of the harms that we talk about, some of them could have been preempted with, more representation in the design process, the development process, more consideration of what could happen, more foresight, more thinking about the future. And then there are some things which, because technology is part of a social and technical system working together, you can't really anticipate the confluence of factors that could come together to produce a particular harm. So then I think it becomes a lot more around what sorts of governance mechanisms, what sorts of monitoring, that it's not just a set and forget, put the technology out in the wild. Like, how are you actually continuing to engage with its impacts and course correct or decommission if it actually is, very beyond a certain threshold of harm. So I think there's a lot of, it's part of a whole life cycle. It's not just at one point in time where these harms could emerge and they can change based on the context in which they're sitting, which makes it very complex and complicated as well.
All right. I'm going to ask another question, which is going to lead on to a bigger question, but I think it's important to establish this now that we're a full 40 minutes into this panel. What is AI? Paola, I think you're the best place to answer this, but I might just be being mean.
Am I allowed to say? I don't know. No. The AI, like the analogy I always like is when you're a scientist, you have statistics, plain statistics, right? Then you call them Bayesian statistics, and then you put a little framework into it, and then that is called machine learning. And then the machine learning, when you go and you talk to an audience like this one, and you call it artificial intelligence. So I think it's AI is a set of mathematical formula statistics working on our current data. So Google and Facebook and all the social media platforms collect data on you for many years, and then they use that data to train models, and then those models predict future behaviors. So that's what we call machine learning or AI, but in general, it's a very broad term and it covers a lot. So it's practically a set of tools that are automating some of the steps that humans most likely don't like to do, and then they become very smart, and then they start predicting things.
Awesome.
Anyone else that
I
wants
thought
to
that was
help me
really
with
good.
that?
I often get asked this question as well in my work, and I'm always just like, it's like data science, but more. Like if you just did more of it, and made the computer do more of it, that's AI. So I thought that was an awesome answer. Thank
pretty
you.
much.
And I think like the most important message really in that to our audience is that if you aren't totally sure what AI is, that's because the definition is kind of vague, and it's okay that you're not sure.
It's kind of great.
The bigger question
Yeah.
that kind of leads on from this, so that one was from C. Vandes on YouTube, and then Catherine F on YouTube asked this question, which is building more responsible AI that is better for society. Like, how do we do it? Is it for the consumer to demand it, educators to teach, or regulators to demand it? Like, how do we kind of fit all those pieces together? And Mark, I think we might start with you on this.
Thanks, Sophia. So with that, I actually have an analogy to basically start the conversation. I don't have the full answer, but just an analogy to start with. So, for example, with new versions of the Apple iOS or macOS updates, they keep on pushing out new features. But then again, one of the cool new features we have recently is, hey, if you install this update, you get some more privacy protection for your Safari browsing have example, and you have open source browsers like Mozilla Firefox going, hey, we have new features that make sure your internet browsing doesn't interfere with Facebook's tracking cookies. And sooner or later, customers would realize that, so consumers would just go, yep, hang on a minute, these things are there, and it's quite good initiative. I didn't know about this earlier. So that's one way of how consumers can demand for more ethical uses of AI to be more apparent. But I think it needs to be a holistic effort. It needs to be, as you rightly pointed out, Sophia, regulators have to play their part and educators as well. So as all of us as science communicators, we have to let everyone know about why AI needs to be ethical. It's not just math, as Paola mentioned, math with a frame, another frame around it, and just call it artificial intelligence.
Does anyone else want to sort of build on it with their views as to like how we build this good AI world?
I think part of the conversation around the role of government or role of regulators was part of the work that I was doing with the Centre for Public Impact around, what role should dignity play in AI ethics instruments for governments, and really where we landed with that was that the role of government, in theory, is associated with dignity of people. It's associated with democracy, these sorts of broad values. And one of the things that we were really interested in is how does that show up? How does ethics show up when we're looking at government AI ethics instruments? How does dignity show up if we believe that that's an important value for a government to be enabling, like conditions for human flourishing? And what we sort of found through the research was that the government's view of AI ethics in some ways has been sort of oversimplified to this sense of harm minimization or protective measures, ways to protect people's dignity from violations and potentially to remedy if something bad does happen. And what our work is really was trying to do is to extend that conversation beyond a harm minimization conversation and to say, well, actually governments have a responsibility beyond just protecting citizens to also enabling, promoting, enhancing dignity as well. So not just minimizing the downside, but also optimizing an upside of what these technologies can do. So I think in terms of the question around, what role can consumers play, what role can governments play, it's quite within government's remit of a healthy, flourishing society to do both protective and proactive measures when it comes to promoting and protecting from dignity
Lorraine, are you able to define a little bit more what you mean by dignity? I can't find the question in exact wording quicker, but I know that someone's asked for that.
Yeah, it's a great question, and one of the first questions that we were looking at too, because obviously there's lots of different ways that you can define it. And one of the things that we really came up with was to look at other people who've, explored this topic a lot more than we have. And one of the big academics that we found was actually from the international conflict resolution space, and her name's Dr. Donna Hicks. And she has looked at dignity from a very practical perspective in terms of what are some of the elements that make up dignity. And at its core, she would define it, and this is sort of the definition that we took on board, as a desire to be seen, a desire to be heard, a desire to be listened to be treated fairly, to be recognised, to understood, and to be understood and to be feel safe in the world. And she has quite a pragmatic model for what dignity looks like in terms of there being 10 elements. So part of that is acceptance of identity, part of that is safety, both psychological and physical safety, part of that's accountability, inclusion, fairness, benefit of the doubt, these sorts of things she's identified. And we use that model of dignity, and then we look to extend that model of dignity not just to be about the elements, but the relationship between actors in what you do in relation to dignity. So you can acknowledge dignity, you can violate someone's dignity, but you can also promote someone or enhance someone's dignity. And that was sort of the layer on top that we used as a part of our dignity lens.
Thank you so much for that definition. That's really helpful. Unless anyone else wants to talk about how we're going to build this perfect AI world in the future, I definitely have so many questions from our YouTubers.
I can just add a little bit on Loren's, just because we are working together on this. So Loren is the one who's been preparing this framework, which has been very useful for practitioners like me. When we are building models, usually we were taking different considerations on the ethical space, but now we are using her framework to actually pinpoint each one of the steps on the way. So when she talks about acceptance of identity and dignity, one of the examples is we are building an auto-classification tool for grants. And so we need to think about how is this grant how is this tool keeping the human dignity? And so one of the many ways is trying to bring external people to review the model, trying to bring external people to review the data, consultation with the users. And with all of these steps, we are trying to keep the dignity of the user, of the person who's coming to review, of the person who's giving solutions, giving talks about this tool in public so that other scientists bring other ideas. So having this transparency and openness when you're building the model itself is one of the ways that you can keep the human dignity on your work. But yeah, I won't stop you, Sophia. You can keep going.
Does Darren have things he wants to add?
Yeah, look, I really love listening to both Loren and Howard talk about this, because it reminds me of the reason why I've ended up where I am is that I felt no dignity in the way that Aboriginal people, and particularly Aboriginal men, were being portrayed in the media, in big reports and all this. And you only have to look at the Northern Territory intervention, which suddenly tried to make the Australian population think every Aboriginal male was a perpetrator of pedophilia. And the problem is that our dignity was completely shot. And I mean, we didn't really have much prepared, much backed up by the data and the media and everything that was going on at the time. So when I think about just a practical example, I worked in the hospital system on the Improving Care for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Patients program. And we realised that there was problems in the flow of data from the client to the data set, or the minimum data set, if you like. And the example I'd pick is the admitted episodes data set. And we knew that was an issue with it, because along the way there would be situations where admission staff wouldn't ask the question if a client came in, and they would make assumptions about that person, and that affected the coding of information. And sometimes, there would be an assumption that that person might be drunk, and they might not be. They might have a brain injury, but because they're Aboriginal, that connection already got made, and you could see the imprint in the data. So the dignity of that person was taken away. And so you can see these little practical things happening all the way. And this is where, potentially AI can look at that and go, yes, we can see humans are making implicit bias impacts or imprints upon the data. And so, if that's happening just for, Aboriginal people, I'm sure it'll happen for a lot of other people, and particularly anybody that has any kind of, communication problem that is then warped by a capture system. So, if we can get it right for Aboriginal people, you can probably get it right for a lot of other groups too.
Yeah, and of course there's particular danger in doing that in the healthcare system, as I'm sure we're all aware. I certainly know that Vic Pol has been very quiet about using sort of data science to try and target high crime neighborhoods. I wonder what possible neighborhoods those could be. It's a mystery. So one sort of second penultimate question. I say penultimate question. There's two of them, so let's work with this. These are sort of the same question from different angles. The first one from C. Lockhart Thompson on YouTube, asking sort of like, how can we ensure AI that is developed for good isn't applied to bad applications? So like when you use targeted advertising to try and sway elections, as we've seen in great detail in the US. And the other side of that coin, the maybe more blunt side of that coin, from Patrick, why are the companies that do the most AI research so evil? So I think as someone who does ethics, Mark, maybe you're best to start on what is good and evil, and why companies fall into one or the other.
I don't work in big tech companies, so I can't answer for them. But what I can say is there is an inherent tension between inherent tension between the objectives of the tech company. So take, for example, YouTube. So for us, we might think as consumers, YouTube, they should probably give us information that makes sense, is robust, it's factually correct, especially news broadcasts, etc. But then again, YouTube or Google's parent company has the other inherent tension because they need to make money somehow. And advertising means they have to sustain users' attention. And how do they sustain attention? They have this fancy algorithm that everyone's trying to game to get their video up there. So again, you see this inherent tension between informing the public about factual information versus, hey, we need to get profits anyway. So how do we prioritize videos that would get people viewing it the longest, for instance? So that inherent tension is probably one of the reasons why companies are, well, to put in the dichotomy of good and evil, tending towards evil. I think the next part of that question is in, again, it's me just getting the conversation going. So how could we make sure it's not, technology is not used for a nefarious purpose? So in its, for example, when people first join social media sites, it's just, let's chat with mates online, share photos, etc. But over time, the product evolved into something completely different, and it came with its own set of problems, as you rightly pointed out, influencing elections for advertising. So one way, again, this is just one way to do this, is for, I think some of the panelists mentioned this at an earlier point, constant auditing to make sure at any given moment the product is still fit for purpose, it's doing what it should, and it's not just used for other purposes beyond what it's created for. But I'd love to hear what other panelists have to say as well.
I feel really mean now because I have to jump to the final question. We only got your beautiful input. Unless anyone has like a one sentence thing they can say about this.
Really quickly, I think that there's a structural piece to this about, the system isn't broken, it's working completely well. And this is the outcome of that. So what structurally needs to change? And I think a couple of things are around feedback loops of how quickly there's feedback if things go wrong and what gets done about it, what are the accountability structures, and funding structures or other incentive structures and how they might change, which is linked to your business model comment before, Mark. about new things that might need to change structurally how that system is working right now.
Thank you so much, Lorraine. It's honestly like the worst part of the MC job to have to be like, oh, it's time. Like we've got to do the final question. So this again, like one sentence, if you can. I believe in you all, and not one of those sneaky sentences that has 4 semicolons in it. But to all panelists, within the next 5 to 10 years, how would you like to see AI, big data, and related technologies used to benefit our society? Let's start with Paula.
Okay. I think in general, what I would like to see is education across everyone. So I think the main problem at the moment is that we are the transition generation where this AI booming is happening. And so we have the people who uses social media and AI products without understanding them. We have the people who creates the model without understanding the repercussions. We have the people who creates the model seeking commercial venue without caring much about ethical considerations. So in 5 years, I think 5 years, maybe 10, I would love that this becomes our daily lives, that we all talk to each other, that the scientists talk to the public, that the models are transparent so that the user can understand what they are using. In my case, I try to talk to my mother, I try to talk to my father, my grandfather, my cousins, and explain them how this Facebook is working. And so how every time you put a picture on Facebook, what is happening in the background. And I think if you understand what's happening in the background, then you will use it appropriately. And then social media, it becomes a powerful tool. But if you don't understand what's happening, and if the people who is creating it don't understand the repercussions of it, then we have this big gap that we haven't linked. And that is actually really easy to link if we just talk to each other.
Thank you so much, Paula. Darren, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, look, I think the simple thing I'd like to see is that, and we've had a pretty stark and obvious example of this last year in Victoria, where people would look at the data, and if they couldn't see how they can be involved in getting greater sovereignty from that data, and if we take bias sovereignty as a classic example, that everybody, not just Aboriginal people, but everybody starts to understand and get a sense of the value of the currency of their information, because without their information, AI is useless. So, it's what goes in, where it starts, the well, the source. We've got control of that as the people given that information over.
Amazing. Mark?
Fully agree with Darren, and this to add on, also fully agree with Paula. One thing I'd like to add is in next 5 years, I hope us as consumers of technologies know our rights, know what our data is being used for, know how to safeguard our rights from installing ad blockers to privacy-conscious browsers, and yep, that's my dream in the next few years.
And lucky last, Lorraine.
Well, I hope that in the next 5 to 10 years, there's a greater awareness and intentionality of the values that are at the center of technologies of the future, and people are choosing to design and also to consume technologies that have values like dignity at the center.
This was so wonderful. Oh my goodness. My heart is fully warmed. Tonight was actually the last of this year's Pint of Science panel series. So we are all the lucky last. And we've covered a huge range of topics, from the fun side of maths, which in my opinion is all maths, emerging cancer cures and preventions, human space travel, the future of food, the plight of Australian wildlife, and finally tonight on the ethics of digital data. You can check any of the talks you missed on the Pint of Science YouTube channel. And we know that you still have so many questions. We saw them all coming through on YouTube, and it's awesome. We love this level of engagement. Feel free to put them on Twitter. I'm dumping our panelists in it, but like at them on Twitter. Just like send them your questions directly. I feel like they'd really be up for that. And I haven't asked any of them before this, so if they block you, I'm sorry. Thank you so much to all the Pint of Science volunteers who have done so much work over the last month to put these online events together. I'm actually wearing my Pint of Science t-shirt from when I was a volunteer way back in 2015 or 2016. Can guarantee it is so much work and a lot of stress. So really, like, huge thank you to everyone involved, including the team of Pint panel organizers who helped us do things like this. It was such a cool panel. Pint of Science is entirely supported by volunteers, so if you've watched this, if you've enjoyed it, and if you're able to, please leave us a donation on the Pint of Science Australia website. We understand that not everyone will be in a position to donate, particularly after the year we've had. So really only give if you can, but every little bit helps, truly. And thank you so much to all of our panelists and you, the audience. You came, you asked questions, you were a friend of mine who I just repeatedly sent the link to this event until you gave in and attended. Whoever you are, maybe you're actually interested. Maybe you're someone that I just kept going, you should join this meeting. But Pint of Science events, however they are, whether they're online, together, socially distanced outside, or just like having a chill time on Twitter, they're all about connecting over conversations. And I really hope that you felt connected tonight, because I certainly felt connected both to you, our audience, and all of these other panelists. Let's get them back on screen. I want to give them a little round of applause, even though it's just me who can hear and do this. Bring them back, please. There we are. Yay! I think everyone was awesome. But thank you. Have an excellent evening, and good luck, everyone in Melbourne.